Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Get Healthy monthly webinar. Today we have an extremely special guest. We are with XYMOGEN and Dr. James Munro. We are going to be talking about cognitive performance under pressure, which may seem like a topic that you might not think is that important, but honestly, in the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen the influence of cognitive performance impact everything. So I'm super excited to hear from Dr. Munro today. Just a small introduction on who he is. Dr. James Munro graduated from the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, with a doctorate in naturopathic medicine, internally serving as the Director of Clinical Services at XYMOGEN. Dr. Munro is the Medical Director and Senior Director of Innovation at XYMOGEN as well, and WholeScripts. He helps develop the product-exclusive professional formulas that provide quality supplements to healthcare professionals like yourself. His dedication to providing top-quality care, especially in chronic disease related to gut-brain axis, has led him to take a social media world by storm. And I personally follow Dr. Munro on all socials, so you should as well, because he shares his wisdom across LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. He also has his own blog. So, Dr. James Munro, I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you for being part of this, and I will step back and let you take the reins.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. And taking the social media world by storm, I did not write that. So
I might have embellished a bit there, but I have to admit, you did. You blew up in like a week, and you know it.
by storm. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about some fun stuff. Um, yeah, we'll just get right into it. Cognitive performance under pressure. We'll define that in just a moment. But before we get started, there is actually a special offer for current attendees. If you're watching this right now, you can scan this code and attend our XYMOGEN experience. I actually have another slide with all of the speakers, a really amazing speaker lineup. So you can scan this code and get $249 registration. The standard is $495, so it's a pretty monster discount. So that is specific for this webinar right now. I'll show the QR code at the end again. So if you want to, go ahead and take a quick snapshot of that. It's going to be, it says here, October 16th and 18th in Orlando at a really swanky resort. Very cool place. Should be an amazing event. I'll be there. We can hang out. There's like, food, and it's a whole resort thing. It should be awesome. Okay, so with that, and about me, we basically already went through that, so we don't need to get too deep into it. The disclaimers, this always is really important. I would always suggest that, I always put it like this: try to prove me wrong before you implement any of this stuff into practice. So don't necessarily trust me and take me at my word. There are references in here embedded in the slides throughout. Look at those references and develop your own opinions on all of this. I've tried my best to show you like the data at large, but there's a lot of data out there, so maybe I cherry picked stuff. So make sure that I didn't cherry pick the best data, and make sure that you agree with my interpretation of all this stuff before you implement it into practice. And like Dr. Stroup mentioned, I work for XYMOGEN, which is relevant here because I'm going to be talking about supplements and things like that. And I pretty much always start every talk by grounding everyone in the therapeutic order of naturopathic medicine, which I did not invent. This is just the naturopathic medicine kind of credo. And as a quick rundown of it, at the very top, you see high force interventions up here, and at the bottom is establish the foundation for optimum health. So what that means is everything is on this spectrum, but you want to work your way up. So if you do have to jump straight to a high force intervention, you don't want to ignore the foundations for health, which would be sleeping, relationships. Do you have a social network, all of that kind of stuff, really baseline stuff, and then you kind of walk up from there. And so if you jump to a high force intervention and you have not, okay, let's say you take the best medication in the whole world, you have the fanciest, most cutting edge surgery. If you don't sleep, you're just not going to get through whatever it is you're trying to get through. So while everything's on the table, it's important that we make sure we cover all the bases. And I find this really important for this particular conversation because we're talking about energy metabolism and cognitive performance. And so I'll frame that in terms of the therapeutic order, just to kind of ground us and keep us centered in that. So talking about cognitive performance under pressure, what does it mean to be under pressure? And I could not resist the opportunity to show these two gentlemen. If you don't get this reference, just type under pressure into your Spotify and enjoy the magic that ensues. And a fun fact, my son's name is Bowie, mostly because my wife wouldn't let me name him Mercury. But good stuff. Anyway, in this context, under pressure, I'm really referring to excessive or increased energy consumption or a depleted energy state. And in this context, even more deeply with regards to the brain. So this is the brain energy state, which there's very much that parallels the whole body. But that's kind of the definition that I'm using. Cognitive performance under pressure, meaning you have this increased energy expenditure, consumption, or a depleted energy state. And how do we deal with that appropriately? And so this is where we start to get into the therapeutic order. Biohacks, and I sort of hate that word, but they can be really helpful. But not if you're not appropriately managing your energy. If you're struggling in that area, you don't have the energy that your body needs, a lot of the biohack stuff isn't as helpful. And there are biohacks that are directly contributing to energy metabolism, which are helpful. But just thinking about the way that our body produces energy is really important. If you don't have those bases covered, then adding the fancy, cool, amazing, specific mechanisms on top of that is not going to be as effective as it otherwise could if you had a more robust foundation built underneath it. So with that, we'll talk about the metabolic energy systems. The goal of metabolic energy and building energy in the body is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And here's a fancy little drawing. And we have 3 phosphate groups here just to remind us about all that biochemistry stuff. And this represents a lot of potential energy. And so when this 3rd phosphate group breaks off, it releases energy, and that can be used for various biochemical processes. And so this is the important molecule when it comes to cellular energy. And so there are 3 basic systems that our body uses. And here's a nice diagram here, but we'll walk through it. Mitochondrial respiration, that is aerobic ATP production. This is a complete oxidation of fuels, carbohydrates, and fats inside the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. This is the slowest rate of ATP production, but it has the greatest capacity. So you can really start cranking it out when this big machine gets going, but it takes a while to get it going. It uses the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle, depending on where and when you went to school, that horrible, horrible cycle that you had to learn about, and relies on that electron transport chain to produce that ATP. It supports a prolonged exercise, like beyond the 2-minute range. Once you hit that 2 minutes and then you're going for longer, that's when this system really steps up. So think about those endurance exercises, your long distance running, your cycling, swimming, hikes or brisk walks, those endurance types of exercises. Then the next system is the glycolytic system. And this breaks down glucose and or glycogen to produce ATP. This is activated immediately. Once you start doing whatever, it's going to start pumping out the ATP through this system, and it reaches peak output in about 10 to 15 seconds. This is an anaerobic production of ATP, and it yields a moderate amount of ATP, but really quickly. So it'll get things going, and it's not going to be as efficient and productive as the mitochondrial respiration, but more so than the phosphagen system, which we'll look at next. It produces lactate when the oxygen can't keep up. And this is 200-meter sprints or your high-intensity interval trainings, kind of like the in-between. Pretty explosive, but getting towards the endurance side of things, but not quite there yet. And then we have the phosphagen system, and this is the really quick one. This is the immediate onset of exercise. The phosphagen system is the first one that's going to start to throw that ATP into the system. It uses phosphocreatine to regenerate that ATP via creatine kinase. We'll get into these details a little bit later. It's the fastest ATP regeneration, but the capacity is really small. So it spits out ATP instantaneously, but then it needs to recharge after that. This is anaerobic, does not require oxygen. I mentioned the stores deplete quite quickly and need recovery time. And this dominates during those explosive efforts, those 0 to 6 seconds. So think that sprint start, heavy lifting, jumping, quick maximal efforts. And so when you look at it on a timeline, it'll look like this. So we have the phosphagen system that pops up immediately and starts cranking out that ATP, but you can see it drops off really quickly. And then the glycolytic picks up on that. And then the mitochondrial respiration is slowly starting to turn on. And then this is only 100 seconds, this whole graph here. So once we get to that 100 to 120 seconds, that's when the mitochondrial respiration is at its peak capacity and keeps going from there. But something that's really important to recognize is it's not just phosphagen, then glycolytic, then mitochondrial respiration. That is how it's going to happen when it starts. But if you're in the middle of an endurance exercise and then you have a quick explosion, then the phosphagen system will act as that buffer. You're going to basically run out of ATP from the mitochondrial respiration, and you're going to need a little bit extra. And the phosphagen system or the glycolytic system, depending on the duration of that explosion, those systems are going to step up and create a buffer so you don't just collapse. Otherwise, you really wouldn't be able to have a variable effort expenditure. So that was a fun, nerdy talk, but it really sets the foundation for this. So this is what happens in all of our bodies. So the musculature for sure, but also this is how energy metabolism works in our brain as well. So this is relevant to basically every energy output in any aspect of our body. So creatine, I mentioned phosphocreatine in here. So let's talk about that. Let's quickly define it just so we know what we're talking about here. It's all over social media. People talk about it all the time. But I've found that people are misinformed about a lot of some small things and some pretty profound things. So let's just kind of define it to make sure we're all on the same page here. So cellular energy, we'll talk about that a little bit, and widely used to fuel muscle health. And we'll look a little bit deeply into that too. So about half of the creatine that we need is produced endogenously through some various amino acids, and then the rest needs to come in through our diet or supplement. And some good dietary sources are basically carnivorous foods, meat and fish, and then the supplement form would be creatine monohydrate. We'll get into some like supplemental options later, but those are the two basic food and supplemental forms. So creatine storage, 95% of that creatine is stored in muscles. It just basically immediately goes into the muscles. The second it hits the bloodstream, there's no barrier to entry when it comes to getting that creatine from the blood into the muscles. But it's also stored in other places: heart, brain, kidney, retinal, testicular tissues. And there are going to be some impacts in those areas as well. We're obviously going to focus on the brain in just a minute. Creatine levels are impacted by, probably not too surprising, diet is a really big one. We're only producing half of the creatine we need. So the diet is reliant. We're relying on the diet for the rest of the creatine that's required. And if you don't have a diet rich in creatine, you're going to suffer there. Physical activity can impact. We can deplete our creatine levels and all that depending on our physical activity level. And then aging. The bummer of life is that we run out of like all the good stuff in our body as we age, and creatine is one of those good things that we just start running out of. Sorry about that. Nothing I can do. So there's kind of a disproportionate benefit of creatine in terms of muscle tissues, and that kind of makes sense given it's all in the muscles, right? So creatine is going to help the muscles most. But that doesn't mean it doesn't help these other areas as well. So we're not going to focus on the muscle very much, and we'll focus on the brain a little bit more. So the role of creatine in cellular energy production, well, we kind of already called it out a little bit, but I will kind of specifically name how this is working. So creatine it turns into phosphocreatine. So remember, we have that ATP, which is the three phosphate groups. Creatine will bind on to a phosphate and a nice stable molecule. And when the ATP, the adenosine triphosphate, loses that third phosphate and goes to ADP to create that potential energy again, a phosphate group has to be added. And that's where creatine comes into play. It will donate that phosphate group to the ADP to reproduce the ATP. So the creatine stores that phosphate group. The phosphate group is then donated to the ATP, the used up ATP, to recycle it back. And then that ADP is recycled to the ATP, and that's the energy source. And a very important point to note, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about why it's so important to note, but 1 to 2% of stored creatine gets metabolized into creatinine, which has major implications for some various things. All right, so now kind of the fun stuff here. When it comes to creatine and cognitive function, this is what I find super fascinating. So 20 grams a day will increase muscle creatine by about 20 to 40% in days, 5 to 7 days. It doesn't take a long time to really just saturate the muscle tissue with creatine. But when you contrast that with how it interacts with the brain, it's quite a different story. In the brain, that same 20-gram dose per day will increase that brain creatine by 8 to 10% in 4 weeks. It takes so much longer to get creatine in the brain. So you need higher doses and you need longer duration. So this is the start of that conversation. You might be thinking like 20 grams is quite a bit. And it is. There was an old school technique of like loading, like a creatine loading phase with the 20 grams. There's no harm noted at these higher doses. So that's important to note. But also when it comes to musculature, that loading dose isn't really necessary. It'll bump up your levels faster, but it'll also get to those same levels in about 1 month of that 5-gram dose per day. But with the brain, it's a little bit different. There are some situations where the lower doses will impact the brain, and we'll talk about that. But if you're really trying to force creatine into the brain, higher doses are often warranted and sometimes completely necessary. And there is one very specific reason for that. That is how it gets into the brain. So I mentioned there's no barrier to entry when it comes to getting creatine from the bloodstream into the muscles. There is a barrier to entry when it comes to getting it into the brain, and that is the creatine transporters. There are not creatine transporters in the muscles. The creatine just goes in, throws the door open, and gets into the muscle cells. The brain, not so easy. It has to go through these specific transporters, and these transporters are coded for by a gene SLC6A8. So this gene is coding for a specific transporter protein that will take the creatine across the blood-brain barrier and put it into the brain. So this is kind of a can of worms, honestly, very beyond my expertise, but we know there are genetic variations. We know there are epigenetics at play. So there's a lot of stuff that I don't personally understand. Maybe someone does, but there's a lot of stuff that's going to impact this gene and these transporters that are going to significantly impact how creatine moves across the blood-brain barrier. So I have some ideas on how to maximize this, but there's going to be some individual variability, and there are going to be situational variability too, depending on a few things. And we'll get to some of those. But like I said, really, when you start diving deep into this, like the epigenetics and this specific gene, and if there are variants that impact the transporter, beyond me, and I'm sure there's a lot there. So it's a really fascinating area to look out for. So we'll highlight a few studies here. Wrong way. A few studies looking at creatine and cognitive function in both young and older adults. And the little disclaimer here is we're at the beginning stages. Creatine, specifically creatine monohydrate, is the most studied supplement out there. Um, but it's a lot in the musculature. And when we're looking at studies in terms of brain function, that's newer. That's a new kind of fascinating area of research. And there are more studies coming out, and we'll look at a few here, but it's not to the same level as it is in the muscle research. So we know that creatine is, there's so many studies on it, but not a ton of them are focused on this area. So we have more to learn. And that's my little disclaimer on here. So this one is looking at vegetarian adults, and think back to that other slide. The best dietary sources are carnivorous. The meat and the fish are going to be the best sources. So vegetarians typically have lower starting levels of creatine, which means vegetarians may disproportionately be benefited by supplementing with creatine. But nonetheless, this was on a small group of young vegetarian adults, 5 grams per day for 6 weeks, and they found that working memory and intelligence tasks significantly were impacted in a positive way. So that's promising. Short-term, healthy young adults, 8 grams for 5 days, and the cognitive decline associated with mental fatigue, so think like sleep deprivation, that was improved, or that decline was reduced. And then we have a meta-analysis looking at older adults. And this one was cool. This looked at memory performance in general. And regardless of dose, duration, sex, geographical location, there was enhanced measures of that memory performance across the board in these older adults. And then another meta-analysis. This is a much bigger range, ages 20 through 76, showing potential benefits in the area of memory, attention time, and processing speed. So there's reason to believe that this is something to go after. We have more to learn, but there's definitely some interesting stuff here. So back to how this is working. Again, I mentioned it already. Those 3 energy systems, they are happening in the brain, right? That's exactly how energy is produced. So creatine is very important for making sure that we have that ATP buffer. We have the mitochondrial respiration, we have the glycolytic system. But when we're shifting between these zones, we need to make sure that we have a buffer to cover the ATP need when there is increased activity there. And so creatine is crucial for that. The cognitive effects appear less pronounced in younger individuals. And I would add to this, also less pronounced in healthy individuals without stress and all that stuff. And there is a really interesting reason for that. It's because creatine uptake appears to change with need. And well, for the brain, the brain uptake of creatine changes with need. And so think aging, stress, sleep deprivation, neurological disease. Creatine has really gained a lot of attention recently for its use in sleep deprivation or jet lag. And these are all situations where you have this increased energy need in the brain. And so taking creatine at that moment will likely lead to a more of an increase in the brain creatine than it would otherwise. So this seems to be why there's a lot of varying research in terms of brain studies. Well, like, did the person need it? Think like a 20-year-old who's stress-free, doing great, regular exercise, but nothing too extreme. Creatine's not going to touch the brain, right? That's not going to show any improvement there. But that same 20-year-old who's been up for 4 days straight studying or doing whatever, that person that takes the creatine, it is going to improve their cognitive performance there. And then the same thing, as we age, the stress on our body just kind of, it just keeps going. And so we just have this built-in stress as we get older, and creatine can be helpful there. But I find it very interesting that creatine does not just automatically help everyone all the time in the brain. It will get into the muscles, but that's that separate conversation. But yeah, the brain only accepts the creatine when it's needed. So that is why we're going to see, unless we study the right populations, we're going to see varying results in a lot of these research studies. When it comes to adverse reactions, GI upset is the most common and most real one out there. stay tuned. There are ways to avoid or help mitigate that GI upset. And then water retention is another potential adverse reaction. Depends on context. A female who's trying to slim down is always going to complain about water retention. The young dude who's trying to bulk up loves the water retention. So it's all about who you're talking to there. And then kind of paradoxically, dehydration and muscle cramps are noted as adverse reaction, but dehydration, not really. It really isn't. And so how can you have water retention and dehydration? And they're actually very much related because the water retention, what creatine does, will pull water into the cell. And so if you are in a state of even slight dehydration, taking creatine will exacerbate that because it's going to pull the water into the cell, which is going to make you feel more dehydrated. So creatine doesn't cause dehydration, but it can exacerbate an existing dehydration. So making sure that you're hydrated while you're taking creatine is really important. And then the muscle cramps, kind of the same thing. That's not really how it works. It's probably more related to that water retention getting pulled into the cell. And so you'll have dehydration can contribute to those muscle cramps, but also the electrolyte imbalance that can ensue after that. So again, making sure that you are hydrated, making sure that you have a good electrolyte balance. These are important baselines for taking creatine. Testing considerations. There isn't a test that's going to tell you if you need creatine in the brain or the muscle. So it's kind of a bummer. But I guess the bright side of that is the downsides of creatine are very minimal. So it's something that you're pretty safe to experiment with in most cases. Obviously, you're going to want to look at this on a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, throw some creatine in the mix if you think it might help and see what happens. Beware of creatinine. So not actually the creatinine, but the misinterpretation of the creatinine. Remember I said 1 to 2% of the creatine is converted into creatinine and then excreted through the urine. I wish I didn't have to say this, but so many times I've come across not just like lay people and patients, but practitioners or patients that said their doctor told them that creatine is causing kidney damage. It just doesn't. There's a lot of research that has dispelled that myth because that was a concern. What's happening is the creatinine level is increasing because you're taking creatine. So you're taking creatine, it's getting 1 to 2% of it is converting into creatinine, and then you're testing the blood and freaking out because there's more creatinine in there. Well, you put more in there. That makes sense. So that is used to interpret the GFR, right? To calculate the GFR. So someone that doesn't know you're on creatine or doesn't understand the mechanism of creatine and how it's broken down in the body will look at these labs and say, oh, your kidney is failing. Your GFR is really low. Your creatinine is really high. That's not the truth. It's just an exogenous increase of creatinine. This comes up all the time. And so if you're kind of bored of me saying this and you're like, I already know this, that's great. Spread the word because not everyone knows this. And even brilliant practitioners that I greatly respect, they've asked me this, and I'm like, what are you talking about? There is no evidence to suggest that creatine is burdensome on the kidney or causes kidney damage in any way. It is because people are misinterpreting creatinine levels. So avoid it before a blood draw, or just use cystatin C, which isn't impacted by creatine or creatinine, and you can use that to calculate your GFR. Arguably, that's even a better lab as a baseline. But just avoiding creatine for a few days prior to a blood draw can also mitigate this concern. All right, caffeine. So a quick note on caffeine. We're going to tie this back to creatine in a second, which is the real goal of me putting caffeine in here. But caffeine, it's well known to impact cognitive performance. But I thought an interesting touch, I could add the research looking at dose. How much do we actually need? It's not something that I've heard people talk about too much, and it's a very interesting topic, actually. So too much generally is 400 milligrams of caffeine per day. There will be a little bit of individual variability there, but if you start hitting 400 milligrams, I would say no one should really be hitting that level. Some of the common things that'll come up there, insomnia, anxiety, hypertension, headache. The sweet spot may be 200 milligrams per day, but there's actually some mixed research, and I wouldn't call it controversy, just it's not so clear cut. So the research is mixed. And some studies showing that 200 milligrams are peaking that cognitive benefit. But really interestingly, there are other studies that are looking at different doses. So one group did 12 and a half, one group did 25, and just keep going up through 200. And it was similar effects across the board for all of them. So very interesting, right? 200 milligrams. If you have no idea what's going on, that's maybe a good goal to shoot for, but there's going to be individual variability. And that's really the takeaway here is consider the optimal dose on an individual basis. We know that we have fast metabolizers, slow metabolizers, habitual caffeine users. Individuals are going to respond differently to caffeine levels. So you can experiment based on that. The takeaway is definitely not more than 400 and 200 or less is probably going to be the sweet spot for most everyone out there. But the real reason I snuck caffeine in here is because there's a question mark when it comes to combining creatine and caffeine. So let's dive into the research. So these are two totally different pathways. And so you'd think they are very synergistic and complementary, creatine boosting ATP like we talked about, and caffeine stimulating central nervous system and endurance pathways. So two totally different mechanisms. You'd think this is a match made in heaven. But there's a question mark there. So some studies are showing that caffeine can blunt the ergogenic effects of creatine. And I don't totally buy this, but the research is calling out possibly it's having to do with opposing effects on muscle relaxation time. I didn't mention it. We're talking about the muscle effects of creatine being blunted here. So the opposing effects on the relaxation time, so kind of a push and pull. I don't totally buy that. Or GI discomfort when those two things are taken together. Also, I don't necessarily buy that, but there might be something going on here. So when we look at the systematic review findings, acute caffeine after the creatine loading doesn't appear to impair creatine's benefits. So after you have saturated muscle levels of creatine, adding acute caffeine after that doesn't seem to impact things. But another set of research studies is showing that during creatine loading, caffeine might interfere. And might is the word. It's not a definite. So that's something to think about. If you have tissue saturation of creatine, adding caffeine doesn't seem like it's going to be much of an issue. But if you are trying to load, that's where maybe things might be impacted negatively in terms of musculature. But now here's what we are talking about, cognition as opposed to that physical performance. So in controlled trials with both creatine and caffeine, the cognitive performance was improved with the combination over that caffeine alone. So you got to weigh your pros and cons in the specific situation. If you're doing an all-night study session, caffeine and creatine might be awesome. If you're trying to maximize efforts at the gym, that's where maybe that combination might not be so helpful. All right. And now we're going to crank through some of this stuff, which is really important, but kind of easy conversations. I could talk about magnesium forever. I love it so much. It does so many cool things. But let's remember the goal here. We're trying to build ATP, and we need those 3 phosphate groups. So this is a cute little picture. It works really nicely for a presentation, but we got to do the nerdy chemistry talk here. So this is exactly this, just written in a different way, a little bit of the going back to OChem. And so we're going to shift over to this drawing here. So ATP, this is what we always think about with ATP. And here are our phosphate groups. And then this one breaks off to give us that potential, turn that potential energy into energy used for biochemical reactions. And we always picture this molecule. This is not actually a bioactive molecule. It's a very unstable molecule. If we see this in nature, it basically just falls apart and the body cannot use it to create energy. So that's the cool thing here. So what does the body actually use? What's the bioactive form? It's attached to magnesium. It's a magnesium ATP complex. That's how the body works. And don't anyone call me out. It could also be attached right here. So just to cover my chemistry bases. But consider that, right? If all of your energy systems, your mitochondrial respiration, your glycolytic system, your phosphagen system, they're all working perfectly and pumping out a ton of ATP. If you don't have an adequate amount of magnesium in your body, that ATP is going to waste. It needs to be stabilized with magnesium and become bioactive. So magnesium is a gigantic part of this story. And magnesium is thought of in terms of energy sometimes, but I don't think people give it the credit it really deserves for how important a role it plays in our energy production, in our mitochondrial health. It's profound. So now the kind of bummer facts here. Recommended dietary allowance is between 310 and 420. I would argue it should be higher than that, but we'll just take the FDA's word on it. So we need between 310 and 420, and that's the range has to do with size, age, and gender. Not size, I'm sorry, just age and gender. And then the bummer fact here is the average intake for women is 228, which is lower than 310. And the average intake for men is 323, which is lower than that 420. So that leads us to the understanding that about 48% of the population consumes less than the RDA of magnesium. And remember, I would argue that the RDA is not as much as you need. You need more than the RDA. But heck, if we got 100% of the population just hitting that RDA, I'd be extremely happy there. And testing considerations for magnesium. This is another thing I hate that I have to say, but people get it wrong constantly. I hear about it all the time. Magnesium is an intracellular ion. About 1% of the total body magnesium is found in the serum. And there was a study that said skeletal muscle magnesium deficiency was demonstrated in patients that had normal serum magnesium levels. This was 1995. This is not new stuff. We have another study, no relation between extracellular and intracellular concentrations of sodium and magnesium. This was 1978. This is not new. So why is it that serum magnesium is the standard for every basic lab? When I see serum magnesium, I'm like, great, this doesn't tell me anything about your body levels of magnesium at all. So it's not helpful. I use RBC, red blood cell magnesium. It's better. It's still problematic. It's not a perfect test, but it definitely gives you a much better look at how the magnesium is saturating tissues, in this case, simply the red blood cells, which is only one tissue out of however many in our body. So it's not a perfect test, but pretty helpful. And then we have blood sugar management. So I'm going to breeze through this one because this is more of like a concept that I want you to grasp. So when it comes to diabetes and cognitive function, pretty well documented, right? Diabetes is going to impact cognitive function. And we all know Alzheimer's is new names all the time. Type 3 diabetes, right? Like we know that there's a blood sugar and a diabetes component in terms of Alzheimer's and dementia and cognitive function in general. But then let's step down a little bit. Here's this is maybe looks a little bit complicated. I'll make it pretty easy for us. So now we're looking at blood sugar and cognitive function. And so this is brain integrity. So diabetes had the lowest brain integrity and normal glycemic had the highest brain integrity, and the pre-diabetes right in the middle. And then here's a comparison chart between them. And so the really kind of wild thing here is we have the difference between a pre-diabetic 40-year-old and a normal glycemic 40-year-old. The pre-diabetic has about a 6.1 year older brain. So your brain is aging 6.1 years faster than normal glycemic if you're in that pre-diabetes range. But then when you jump down here, the diabetes versus, or sorry, up here, the diabetes versus the normal glycemic, that's a difference of 23.2 years. So your brain is aging exponentially faster when your blood sugar levels are getting higher and higher. And then on this next one, this is looking at insulin and cognitive performance. So this is normal glycemic levels, but insulin levels and insulin sensitivity. And so very strange way to put it, but probability of non-deterioration. So high insulin sensitivity, their brains do not deteriorate. And then low insulin sensitivity or getting closer to insulin resistance have a lower probability of non-deterioration, more likely to deteriorate. Researchers put it in just the weirdest terms. But so then circle back to this conversation, right? This all makes sense why we would need to monitor and optimize blood sugar levels, because the glycolytic system, the mitochondrial respiration, these are reliant upon glucose, right? And when we have insulin resistance, sure, we have a lot of sugar in the blood. We can't get it into the cell where these energy systems are taking place. So making sure that we're managing blood sugar is something that is a must if you want to have cognitive performance in any aspect, whether you're under pressure or not. You need to have well-balanced metabolic systems and metabolic health. So some easy ways to do it, exercise. So there was a recent study that I think is really cool. I've been telling people 15-minute walk after every meal. If you do nothing else, that is going to impact your blood sugar levels in a positive way. And I still tell that to people. But a more recent study compared a 30-minute walk once a day with a 3-minute walk every 45 minutes or 10 squats every 45 minutes. And this is during an 8.5-hour workday. So these are people that are working at a desk, just sitting down. So some of them did 10 squats every 45 minutes. Some of them walked 3 minutes every 45 minutes. And then the other group did one 30-minute walk for the day. And they all did better. But think about this, 10 squats every 45 minutes through that 8.5-hour workday. That's what, 20, 30 seconds? If you were doing them super slowly, that's a minute. You're so 1 minute, 30 seconds every 45 minutes, and you can really change the course of your metabolic health. Of course, you could do more exercise than that, but I find that really kind of inspiring. It's hard to get people to go from I don't exercise ever to like, signing up for a CrossFit gym and doing those like wild pull-ups that they do. But getting someone to do 10 squats or a 3-minute walk every 45 minutes, that's doable, that's attainable, and that can really move the needle. And running a little bit out of time, so I don't want to spend too much time on berberine. But we talked about those different metabolic energy systems, and it's really based on the body recognizing that there's not enough ATP and there's a lot of ADP or AMP, the monophosphate. There's one phosphate group instead of the three that's required. So that's the AMPK activation. That's another body system. So this is a system that turns on when there's an increased energy state, right? So we need energy, and the body says, oh, it turns out we need energy. We're low on energy. And it turns on all these things that bump up the mitochondrial complex, oxygen consumption, glycolysis, right? Mobilizes all the sugars, gets it into the cell. You can see berberine does a lot more than just that. But this directly contributes to our body's ability to produce energy. So I wouldn't use this as like an acute, like I got to pull an all-nighter to study. Like you don't really need to do berberine there, but this is something that you need to make sure that this system is working well, and you can use berberine to get there, or metformin. Exercise can help with this too. But berberine can be a really helpful strategy in making sure we're like balancing our metabolic systems and the way that we utilize sugar in our body. And so for this, I'm not going to blow anyone's mind here, A1C, fasting, and random glucose and insulin. I find those to be very important. Insulin is gaining a little bit more popularity. I measure insulin on every patient I see. I think it's so important because you can have a normal A1C, a normal fasting glucose, and then you'll see a pretty high insulin level. And that tells me you got probably a couple years before you're starting to see that A1C get into dangerous levels. And if you're not measuring insulin, you're late to the game, because you're going to see something pop up on fasting or random glucose or the A1C. You're already like deep in it. You can catch stuff so much sooner if you're looking at the insulin. So now let's talk about some fun stuff. Creatine. I mentioned GI upset is probably the biggest risk or adverse response to creatine. So there's a couple things you can do. One is warm water increases solubility, and creatine in solution is absorbed much better. So not cold water, mixing your creatine with warmer water. And this doesn't have to be like boiling water. If it is boiling water, you might actually break down the molecule and turn it into creatinine before it gets into your body, which isn't helpful. So you don't want to put it in like a boiling pot of water and then drink that down. But warm water, 70, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that, will increase the solubility pretty significantly and can reduce that GI upset. creatine monohydrate is by far the most studied form of creatine. And so that is what I typically recommend. They have a micronized version of creatine monohydrate, which is smaller molecules. And that is a little bit better absorbed, which can, again, help to mitigate some of that GI upset. It's more expensive. So that's something to think about. There's a very small percentage of people that would really significantly benefit from that version, but it's an option and it's out there. Or creatine hydrochloride. That's another option that is slightly more soluble, which could mitigate some of that GI upset. Another good option, but it's just not the one that's studied. The research looking at creatine hydrochloride is just nothing. It is a small fraction of what is out there looking at creatine monohydrate. So the studies on creatine hydrochloride look good. It looks very promising, but I don't totally trust it yet. If someone tells me they have so much GI upset, they've tried micronized and warm water and all that, I'm not against trying the hydrochloride. So it's not a bad option. It's just not the one that we've studied. So I need to see a little bit more. So creatine, XYMOGEN, we're using the monohydrate, and we have this version, just a little scoop, a 5 gram dose. But then we also have stick packs. Really cool if you travel. This is I traveled to India recently, and I brought a bunch of these stick packs. Helped me out a lot with the jet lag. And those are NSF for Sport certified. Just another level of testing. So we don't need to go through all this, but it can just add peace of mind to you or your patients, just knowing that we test the heck out of this stuff. It's very important. We're looking at contaminants. We're looking at banned substances, obviously, but also making sure it has what it says it has in there in a very trusted lab. My favorite magnesium on the whole planet, and my favorite supplement ever, is this one right here, OptiMag Neuro, which is a combination of 3 different chelated forms of magnesium, a lysine glycinate, a threonate, and a malate. We have this is mixed berry. That's like our top selling, or the picture is the unflavored, which tastes like chalk. It's my preferred option. There's no other active ingredients. We have mixed berry and lemon lime, and then we also have capsules in that too. This is like a baseline. I do this one personally every day, and many of my patients end up on this one. You saw those numbers, 48% of Americans aren't even hitting the RDA. So having a supplement can be really helpful for a lot of folks. A little bit more complex of a formula here, ATP Ignite. This has caffeine, B vitamins, electrolytes. A really cool option often people use it as a pre-workout. And then we have a version that is ATP Ignite Workout, very similar, but has creatine in there and peak ATP. So it's actually supplementing with some ATP. But the 3 grams of creatine monohydrate is a really cool addition. So this is also a very popular like pre-workout. And then I mentioned berberine, but this is a berberine, dihydroberberine. So it is partially digested. That's not totally accurate. It's much easier to get into the bloodstream. The body has to go through a couple chemical reactions to get it into the bloodstream, and this one is halfway there. So it's kind of readily taken up by by the enterocytes into the bloodstream. So you can use a lower dose. If you've ever used berberine before, probably the most common thing that happens is GI upset. So with this one, because the absorption is increased, you can use lower doses. So less berberine is in the GI tract to potentially cause irritation. And it stays there for a shorter amount of time because it gets pulled into circulation fairly quickly. So this is a really great option when it comes to berberine supplementation. And then the last one here is berberine ES5 Duo. It's that same dihydroberberine combined with a small amount of chromium, but the rock star here is a brown seaweed extract, which helps to prevent the glucosidase and amylase enzymes from quickly breaking down starches and sugars and absorbing it. So what that means is you'll like blunt the sugar absorption, and you'll see a little bit less of a blood glucose spike after a meal, particularly one that is a little bit more rich in starches or carbohydrates. This is a really great option for those that still struggle with dietary changes. They are having a little bit more starchy, carbohydrate-rich diets, and they want to help to mitigate that without being too burdensome on the diet. Take this before a meal, and it can help to blunt that glycemic bump. And that is it for that. So here is the QR code for the Zymogen experience. Again, I will be there. We can hang out. We got a bunch of really incredible speakers. And if there are any questions, we can talk about that. Otherwise, you could continue with your lunch or whatever else you're doing.
Awesome. Very interesting. Who knew, right?
Hmm.
Creatine has come a long way, hasn't it? It was loved, then it was hated, now it's loved again. It's like the industry can't make up its mind. Um, so I personally like creatine and use it. So I really appreciate how much emphasis you put on just that simple nutrient for everybody. So a few questions. I want to start with the berberine ES5 Duo.
Mhm.
What would you think about placing that
Hmm.
in with somebody that's currently doing something like semaglutide or tirzepatide? Would you think it would enhance lowering the dose because of the way it interacts with
Yeah,
amylase?
there's an inherent interaction there. Not so much with the NC2. Oh,
Hmm.
no, there is there too, because you're going to be getting less into the body. More with the berberine.
Yeah.
So you can push someone into a hypoglycemic state with that. But yeah, at the same time, if you're a practitioner doing it strategically, there's definitely a place for that. I see well, you're probably in the same boat. As a naturopathic doctor, people come to me and say, like, get me off of Ozempic, right?
Right.
So this
They're
is one
always looking for a
strategy.
way for the exit strategy or
Yeah.
just to lower their dose because,
Mhm.
if they're not working, to fix the gut, the foundations, everything you talked about today, then their
Yeah.
dose is usually too high and they're getting side effects. So just looking at that formula kind of sparked something in my head where I was like, this could be a good exit strategy. I just wanted your opinion on it.
Yeah. It's definitely something I use it all the time. So I'll be clear about that. But also don't just say, oh, take this and don't worry about it. You really need to be monitoring. You might need to adjust dose of the GLP-1 agonist, whatever they're using. Yeah.
Right. So who would you, I mean, you kind of gave a protocol today for cognitive performance, under pressure. Who do you think is most at risk today for declining cognitive function? Is it everybody? Do you see certain populations of people? Do you see that? I mean, I understand diabetes type 3, right? I'm sure those are, but what about medications that people are taking and not thinking about how it impacts these nutrients and how it affects long-term cognitive performance? Who would be your target for what you talked about today?
Yeah, well, generally I would say like the aging population. So maybe starting at like 55 on, that's when we need to start being a lot more careful about our brain, but
Hmm.
much before that. So I would argue the biggest opportunity and the biggest threat, both at the same time, is the glycemic index, or not the glycemic index, but the glycemic load of the blood levels of, why am I saying this so terribly?
That's
The
okay. Start
blood
over.
glucose
Strike that.
level.
Reverse
Um,
it.
yeah, what do we have? Like it's something like over 33% of the population is in the pre-diabetic range. Many of
Yeah.
them don't even realize it for the most part. But then when you think about optimal, there was a study kind of a while ago now, but showing that A1C levels above 5.2 is negatively impacting cognitive function as we age. So if you have a 20-year-old at a 5.3, most practitioners say you're doing great. They're slowly chipping away at their
Yeah.
their cognitive ability as they age. So that's we could probably go on with this conversation about like who this would target, but uh, most of America is having trouble with their blood sugar levels, and that is a huge problem.
Yeah. And also the levels are just too broad, right? It's like they let insulin go what to 17 before it's flagged. And I'm thinking, my goodness, I don't like it above 10.
Yes,
Even
I'm
that's too
right with you.
risky for me.
Yeah.
So I think there's some standardization that needs to change, probably in the functional integrative, where we kind of set the trend of what's acceptable. Normal isn't always optimal. Optimal doesn't mean that you're in a healing range. So I appreciated that you brought the blood markers too, and also having the discussion of what is acceptable to Dr. Munro. Where do you keep your clinical practice patients where you say, this might be normal, but this is really what we're shooting for? So I think those conversations are helpful too. Um, I had another one. I wrote all over my notebook. So,
Mm.
oh, I wanted to ask you about the berberine and the dihydroxy versus formulas that have ALA. Do you feel the ALA is a necessary component, or do you feel the berberine in itself is fine? Is there a time that it's warranted to have ALA within those formulas?
Yeah, totally. That's a great option. We have a product that combines both alpha lipoic acid and berberine, Alamax Protect, it's called. Yeah, because they're very complementary and synergistic in you have your AMP kinase activation with berberine, among other things too. That's the one I really point to. But then alpha lipoic acid as an antioxidant is going to help protect against the end damage of having those glycated end products in the bloodstream and lowering blood sugar levels on its own and through a different mechanism. So it's a really great combination. And I use those two together pretty regularly.
Yeah, I do too. I was just interested. I thought now I understand the S5 Duo a little bit better and positioning. So I love that you have so many different formulas with just a tweak that, it fits a different demographic or different
Mhm.
conditions so well to support. So you had talked about creatine at 20 grams a day being taken up into the muscle within 5 to 7 days. Do you change the dose for brain, or do you keep it at 20 and just keep them on a longer therapeutic dose?
Yeah, it's gonna depend. So like that can be burdensome. Taking 20 grams at once, GI
Hmm.
upset,
Right.
most likely. So really what you're looking at
Not
is
according to all the influencers on TikTok. You can just do
yeah.
it.
Yeah, I mean people have done it, I'm
I'm
sure,
like,
but I'm like pretty sure I won't do it. I've never done 20 at one time and I'm pretty sure I never will. But so
yeah,
that means that I'm asking people to do it 4 times a day at that
yeah,
dose. So that's tough. So again, it's going to depend. There's some research showing that 8 grams is having an impact on brain health. And again, think about that need state, right? If you are really young and healthy and you don't really have too much going on and you're just looking for that extra edge, yeah, maybe you're going to need to do 20 grams to move the needle at all in the brain. But someone that is struggling with a lot of stress, sleep deprivation, something like that, you don't necessarily need to go 20. So I look at it, it might be great if you could do 20 grams a day for long term. It's not really realistic. I know, like me personally, I'm not happening. 4 times a day, no way. Maybe for an acute phase, when I was in India, I was just all day I was doing
yeah.
creatine, but that's not something I can maintain. So you look at it like that. There's no recognized risk at that higher dose besides GI upset for the most part. So it's not like it's dangerous to do that, but it's also maybe not practical.
Yeah, it's expensive too. What
Yeah.
is the dose? Is it a 5 gram dose?
Yeah. And the
Okay.
stick packs, and then per scoop, it's 5 grams. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I didn't mean to put you on rapid fire there. I just had questions. So
Always ready.
better understanding your formulations and positioning, and it's really what we try to provide the practitioners. So everyone here, that Zymogen experience, Get Healthy is going to be there too. We're going to be mingling around. Maybe we'll hang out with Dr. Munro for some period of time and some other friends at Zymogen.
Definitely.
Also, take up, and there's so much good information, and your lineup is spectacular. I know Dr. Geo and Dr. Lyons, awesome. Also, if you don't have a wholesale account with Zymogen, I'm sure you can reach out to them and establish that for your in-clinic product use. And don't forget that they're available on our catalog and you can add those to your Get Healthy store. So, Dr. Monroe, thank you so much for imparting all this wisdom. I learned a lot today about creatine and how much more valuable it is than what I actually thought, and the
Great.
great formulas that you guys are doing over there at Zymogen. We certainly appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, for everyone that signed up here and was live today, you will get the playback recording. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.